I can't keep doing this forever.
It's been 20 seconds.
Call it.
Hey, buddy, watch this.
Sometimes all you need is a little CPR to bring things back to life. And it turns out the Rise of Shadows meta has certainly brought some cards to life that we're otherwise not really seeing any play. And I think it's fun to talk about some of these cards and discuss why they're suddenly being played when they weren't before. Because it's always good to keep in mind that cards that aren't good right now doesn't mean they aren't going to be good forever, and new decks and new synergies can come along and suddenly bring them to life. That said, let's take a look at 5 old cards that are now being played that weren't before thanks to Rise of Shadows. Up first here I have Boommastery Arc, and if you take a look at the data on this card, you can see virtually 0 play pre-Rise of Shadows. Then after the rotation, we saw a slow trend upwards, and nowadays Boommastery Arc is a very meta-dominant card thanks to the rise of Mech Hunter, because turns out having a lot of bombs stick around for magnetic mech buffs right now is a really aggressive way to play, and Mech Hunter being one of the top tier decks in Hearthstone for the last month or so means Boommastery Arc is right there alongside them. And Boommastery Arc is one of those cards that I thought seemed like it had some inevitable value in Hearthstone, just because it's one of those things that summons a lot of minions, and anytime you have something that just summons a ton of stuff, it seems to be relevant somewhere along the line. Just took a little while for Hunter to see that, because Hunter had other ways to play that weren't reliant on bombs or mech synergies, much more big death rattle stuff in previous metas. So Boommastery Arc comes along, and it turns out he's a great finisher for a Mech Hunter, because sometimes you need those last few bombs, just a sticky board in the late game to maybe stick that one last magnetic minion and hit your opponent in the face, deal that 8 inevitable damage off the bombs. That gets you over the hump. So he has been an important part of that deck, and I think as long as Mech Hunter is around, Boommastery Arc will remain a relevant piece of it. So card that to me is ultimately not too surprising to see it brought to life in this way, but I'm glad I wasn't totally wrong when I said this card had a lot of potential, and here we are. Moving on to our second card here, I have Murloc Tastyfin, and to be frank, I never thought this card would see play. I am the exact opposite as I was for Boommastery Arc on this one. I thought, you know what, Murloc decks have to play way faster than a card like this can support, because it's really a pretty low tempo minion, right? It's more about resource advantage than board advantage, and we've never seen in the past Murlocs work that way. 3-2 for 4 is just not a good enough stat line when you're trying to like follow up on an early aggressive game plan. But it turns out, because of the rise of Murloc Shaman in Rise of Shadows, and you can see the corresponding rise with Murloc Tastyfin here, including sort of second wind lately with the increasing popularity post-nerf for Murloc Shaman, that this card is in fact fitting the game plan of Murloc Shaman really nicely because of things like Underbelly Angler, a card that shifts the focus for Murlocs a little bit less towards the hyper aggression that it used to be, more towards the mid game, and even towards the late game. When you add in things like Hagatha or Shutterwalk, you can just generate a ton of resources in these decks and reload and reload and reload, and Murloc Tastyfin fits that game plan really nicely. So pre-Rise of Shadows, or at the very least pre the reveal of Underbelly Angler, I never thought this card would make sense. Once we saw Underbelly Angler, I was like, yes, Hagatha, Underbelly Angler, Murloc Tastyfin, it's all going to line up nicely. And we were able to derive a pretty good Murloc Shaman list early on in the Rise of Shadows meta, like a lot of people that shifted it more mid-game than hyper-aggression. So a lot of surprise in this one from a long-term standpoint. Now, again, once we saw Underbelly Angler, it all lined up and made sense. But nonetheless, a bit shocking, I think, compared to the reveal of this card to how much is being played now. Excited to see Murloc Shamans being played that way. I think it's a really cool new take on the archetype and on the tribe. So I'm not upset about it by any means, but interesting nonetheless. Moving on here, I have Masked Contender, and frankly, I don't know if this is really a card most people realize is successful or is being played all that much. I have a feeling if you ask the average Hearthstone player about Masked Contender, they'd be like, yeah, it's still not very good, but it turns out right now actually being played successfully in both Secret Paladins and Secret Hunters, and you can see it took a little while in the chart down there to see this card really rise to prominence. There was like a really early bump right when the expansion came out, then it kind of fell away, but as Secret Hunter has continued to rise and stabilize in the meta, Masked Contender looking like a solid piece of the puzzle for that deck, and now being played in a pretty fair number of decks across Hearthstone. And, you know, not too shocking. I mean, we've seen secret cheat out cards in the past with like Mad Scientist work incredibly well. So I figured, hey, Mass Contender makes a little bit of sense. Now, it is conditional. You have to control the secret, unlike a card like Mad Scientist. So it's never felt quite as dominant, and perhaps that's why it's flown under the radar for a while. But as long as there's some deck that's utilizing secrets in an early game fashion that cares about board, that cares about infusing those secrets into the game, in the early to mid game, Mass Contender is a card that certainly makes sense. I'm not shocked to see this one come into play at all, especially right now in a limited card pool when there just aren't that many good cards in a standard format rotation. Now, this one I think could fall to the wayside as other things come in, even if they're not secret synergy cards. If there's other really good cards that might take a slot like this one, I don't know that he can like fight off the power level that we'll see as more cards are added to the pool. So this one might not last forever, but for now has certainly been brought to life. Up next here, we have Rabble Bouncer from Rosticon's Rumble, card that was seeing virtually zero play. I think some people out there hoped this card would be a great anti-aggro tool, but it turns out, even with a discount here, the body just wasn't enough to trade through aggro boards, and aggro boards can often leverage value trades in really interesting ways. So Rabble Bouncer, as a card in and of itself, really didn't take off at all. It never got there. But as you can see, the play rate for this card is creeping up over time, creeping up. And that's because Conjurer's Calling Mage has been able to successfully use Rabble Bouncer because it is a cheap 7-drop. Sometimes you play it much cheaper, making it easy to combo out with Conjurer's Calling. Also, in a more control-oriented matchup, the kind of thing that just tends to linger around, and then if you Conjurer's Calling it, you're getting 2 7-drops, or even 4 7-drops with Khadgar on board. So this card is interesting to talk about because it doesn't really see play because of what it is so much as because of there's some other really specific synergy being expressed via this card. So I guess in some ways the discount here is good, but only because of Conjurer's Calling. And I think if we saw Conjurer's Calling fall away, this card would certainly fall to the wayside as well. It is attached exclusively to Conjurer's Calling. And you can see, even in this play rate now, it's already dropping a little bit as Conjurer's Calling lists get refined and move more towards Mana Cyclone styles of play. This is getting cut in some lists. So even in that exactly perfect scenario, this one's still not quite holding its edge over other options. That said, still interesting to see how this came to fruition in a sideways direction where a new synergy created its opportunity and not the card necessarily itself. And then finally here I have Replicating Menace, a very interesting card that is in some ways similar to Boommaster Flark in that it saw a big rise thanks to Mech Hunter. That is certainly one deck that uses this very well, but that's not the only deck that's playing Replicating Menace. We've also got some other mech token builds out there, things like Mech Token Druid and even a mech style Zoo Warlock as well that are also using this card successfully. It turns out, you know, this Death Rattle's really nice for 4 mana, and when you add up all the stats for this card, you start to realize, oh, okay, that's actually a pretty big pile of stats. It's spread across multiple minions, so it's really sticky, and a lot of decks like that sticky token style. And then the magnetic also makes it an intriguing buff as well. So a lot of things about this card line up, and I think I was pretty favorable about this card when we first saw the Boomsday project. I was like, yeah, this looks promising. If magnetic things make sense, this is going to get there. Now, it didn't get there for a very long time. It took a while for this card until the rotation where the mech package suddenly became relevant. Replicating Menace was right there as a big core part of it. So not too shocking at all when you think about it. It just took some things to line up, and it really, the rotation in particular had to hit, because a lot of aggro decks like Odd Paladin, for instance, in the past weren't running this because they were odd, right? And mechs just didn't get there because of the dominance of odd and even decks. But when that vacuum opens up, cards like Replicating Menace suddenly look really good. And I think that mech package will probably remain relevant through future expansions, and Replicating Menace will likely remain a part of it. So a card that I don't really see dropping in popularity too much throughout the next year or so. And there you go. Those are 5 cards brought to life in the Rise of Shadows meta. Pretty exciting how some of these cards we think might be bad or just don't have their opportunity suddenly get their moment to shine. I like that in Hearthstone. That's a good thing. It's a good sign of great card design when opportunities become expressed all of a sudden. And I'm curious what cards that aren't seeing play right now will happen to be popular in the future. That's always a cool thing to keep an eye on. Maybe that's even a good video topic for the future as well. Cards that are likely to be brought to life at some point just because they have a lot of opportunity. So if you guys have any other cards you think you're surprised by that they're suddenly seeing play, anything else you think could have been on this list, please feel free to share those in the comments below. If you have any other insights that are interesting, of course, drop those too. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.